Hi, today's video is a continuation of our permitted development series. We're covering off part one of Class E, buildings, etc., which is essentially the permitted development rights that you have at your property to build additional buildings within the curtilage, so within the land that surrounds your existing house. So if you're joining us again, welcome back, and if you're new to the channel, please feel free to subscribe and hit the little bell so that you get reminded when new content comes out. Okay, so just to remind everybody what permitted development is. Permitted development is the additions to your property that you can do without planning permission. It is the series of extensions, additional buildings and alterations that the local authority will sign off without needing to go through the planning process. You can get what's called a lawful development certificate, which if you're selling your property soon, it's a useful thing to have just to let solicitors know that any development that you have done is lawful, and that way it won't slow down the sale. But you do not have to get a lawful development certificate. That's just something that helps, if you like, make sure that you're doing the right thing. Okay, so today we're talking about Class E. Now I like Class E. Class E is great because you can actually do quite a lot with Class E, whereas the extensions and alterations to your actual building are quite tight, and essentially the bigger house you've got, the more you're allowed, and if you've got a small property then you're limited quite a lot to what you're allowed to add on without planning permission. Whereas with Class E there is no real limits. You can build a building that's absolutely huge under permitted development, providing you follow the key guidelines. And so what might you build under Class E? You can do quite a lot. So for example, swimming pools, annexes, garages, storage units, basically anything that's going to be incidental to the enjoyment of your original home. So you cannot put in another dwelling that you'd like to sell off. That's not possible, that's not okay, but you can put in anything that's going to always be attached and tied to your existing home. The other thing that Class E includes is containers for oil and heating liquids. So because those structures can be quite large, they've covered that under Class E because it makes it nice and obvious where you need to look to check your permitted development rights. And so another thing that within Class E they just confirm is that these buildings that you add on to the enjoyment of your property, they can house animals, providing those animals and the livestock are for your enjoyment only, so not for business reasons. You couldn't put up a shed, fill it full of cows and then sell milk. That wouldn't be okay, but you could put up a shed for chickens or for your own pig or something along those lines. As long as it's for you and you only and you're not trying to profit from it, you can use these buildings for livestock. Okay, so as we go into the class, we get the normal things that come up in every single permitted development class. This permitted development right does not exist if your property was created through a change of use. So if it's a barn conversion or if it was an office to residential conversion or something along those lines, you will not be able to use this for adding additional buildings into your curtilage. Moving on to the next point of Class E, it then covers off the restrictions. So you cannot build on more than 50% of the land that creates the curtilage of your building. And if you remember rightly on a previous video, whether you've watched it or not, we talked about what curtilage meant. And curtilage does not mean the boundary of your ownership. So let's just get a pen and show you what we mean. You may have a house, and that when you're sort of looking at your fences and your hedges and whatever it is that surrounds that house, let's say it's just a nice big rectangle. The curtilage is defined as the land that is clearly related to the property that you're living in. So for example, if you owned a big field out the back, you know, your boundary may go all the way around both the field and your sort of garden area, but the curtilage would be defined as this piece of land that is very clearly related to the house. And you're not allowed to build on more than 50% of that land. And that's why I like Class E so much, because 50% of your land is quite a large amount of space. Most people have a reasonable size garden. Even if you have a small property, your garden is probably 1 or 2 times the area of your ground floor of the original house. And so Class E can really help to add additional space to help you enjoy your property a hell of a lot more. So the next part of Part E talks about where your building, your additional building, can be sited, and this is where we talk about principal elevations again. So if you remember rightly from previous videos, a principal elevation is the elevation of your house or the wall of your house that people would consider is the front wall. Now most often that is the wall that faces the highway. It might be at a slight angle. Obviously it gets a little bit confusing if you're on a corner, because you could potentially have two principal elevations, but essentially it is the where your front door is, where your windows are, that face the highway. And so what this says is that what Class E says is that you cannot build anything that's going to sit beyond the front line of your property. And where it gets a little bit confusing here as well is that if the front of your property is stepped, what that means is it means essentially the furthest part back. So I'll just show you two examples. So example one is where you've got a very simple square building. You have an imaginary line that runs across the front of your property. If here is the road, and so what we're allowed to do is we are allowed to build anywhere here, but we're not allowed to do anything that comes past this imaginary line at the front of the property. So that was for a simple square house. Now if your house is a little bit more of a complicated shape, so let's say it's an L shape at the front, so you may have a bit of your property that protrudes out. You see this quite a lot in new build estates and new build properties where there's detail at the front to try and make houses more interesting. Instead of a flat line, most people would think that this is the principal elevation, but it's not. It now turns into an L shape. So the principal elevation runs like this, meaning that in this scenario you can build here, you can build here, but you can't do that even if it doesn't go past this other invisible line. It has to sit behind the back of the principal elevation. You have to make sure that your new building sits behind the line of what's classed as the principal elevation under Class E. And so as I've described before, generally permitted development is telling you, or the way it's worded tells you what you can't have, and so the next part of Class E starts to tell you that you can't have buildings that are more than a single story. So therefore you can't build a two-story annex or swimming pool building, but you can build a single-story one. And there are certain restrictions that help you understand how tall that two-story building can be. So first of all, let's draw in section. If you are building a building and you're going to put a dual pitch roof on it, so two sides, what it essentially says is that can be a maximum of 4 meters. Along with that, your eaves can be a maximum of 2.5 meters. If the building that you're building doesn't have a dual pitch, so if it's a single pitch building, so let's use a different color for a single pitch roof. So if we've got a single pitch roof or a flat roof, for example, then the maximum that this can be is 3 meters. Where this all changes ever so slightly is if you're building within 2 meters of your existing boundary. So if this building sits very close to a wall that divides between your property and a neighbouring property, then the maximum height for everything comes down to this 2.5 meters point. So it's worthwhile really thinking about where any of these additional buildings are going to be put on site, just to make sure you don't fall foul of the height restrictions. So that's it for part 1 of permitted development Class E, buildings and etc. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you like the content that we're creating, please subscribe and tick the little bell so that you can get updated when new videos come out. And please follow us on Facebook and Instagram. My name is Neil Scoxon and this has been part 1 of permitted development Class E, buildings etc.